She's not going to fall for that handsome prince stuff. Try telling her you're an endangered species. Little humor. And of course, this is Monterey County wine in the background. If you can't tell, read the label closely. That's Monterey County. Things to know about ESA. When biological surveys are required for a listed endangered or threatened species, only a biologist licensed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for that species can conduct the survey, or NOAA, if it's something threatened that is in their turf. But that's important. That avoids the problem with some argument of experts where some high-paid business venture saying, we want to build that dam, and then somebody else, we don't want to build that dam. And so you just hire experts. No. You need a licensed biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service who is the expert for that species to be the one in charge of surveys and monitoring the species. It's not a perfect system, but it is an effort to keep money out of the process as much as possible, at least limiting the influence that you have by throwing money at it. The species is represented by a licensed biologist for that species within the Fish and Wildlife Service. A licensed biologist is required under the license to report all biological survey findings. When a biologist conducts a survey, he or she is also looking for other species and habitats that are protected or could be proposed for protection. So it's not looking at one species through a straw. You're trying to look at the picture. You're looking at the habitat, the community, the ecosystem, and what other endangered species might also be in that ecosystem. So even if it isn't your species, you still might be looking for other pieces of information to collaborate with people who have overlapping habitats to yours. A biologist who successfully proposes a species for listing as endangered or threatened will be the primary biological expert on that species. So if it's your work that put them on the list, you are now the expert. Again, trying to keep it scientific as opposed to highest bidder type of mentality when we're talking about protecting endangered species. Very important concept. So you might not be surprised that we have our own California Endangered Species Act, and that's under the California Fish and Game Code, Section 2050. It is similar to the Endangered Species Act. Its policy for the California ESA is to conserve, protect, restore, and enhance, and acquire lands for habitat. That is something unique. The ESA at the federal level, I don't think it has any provision even till today, which specifically talks about acquiring habitat. The California ESA mitigation is roughly proportional to the federal ESA. In other words, what we do to mitigate or protect these animals, they're very similar, but California saw a reason not only to clarify some things that would make it more applicable for California, close some of the loopholes that they saw were potentially abusable at the federal ESA level, but also add this acquiring lands as an important measure, which California really wanted to focus on. State agencies cannot approve any projects that jeopardize species if there are reasonable and prudent alternatives. So you have to look at any project, and if it isn't something that's absolutely unavoidable, if there's any reasonable way to avoid any kind of harm to a species, you must choose the alternative that will not harm the species. If there's a specific economic, social, or other conditions that make infeasible such alternatives, individual projects may be approved if appropriate mitigation and enhancement measures are provided. This has been abused sometimes, but the idea is if you're going to uh, fill up that pond with the endangered frog and you're going to fill it up so you can build the shopping mall, then you need to create a new pond nearby and stock it with those endangered frogs. Um, Again, it is definitely money has not always come out of the ESA activities at the state or federal levels. Sometimes projects are approved because it's convenient or somebody wants to make a bunch of money and they do these half-ass mitigation projects that meet the legal definition of the law without necessarily the spirit of the law. Anyway, so the California Fish and Game Commission is responsible for our own California ESA, and they determine listing with scientific information based on the population of the species, its range or distribution of habitat, history of population, and impacts not only of human activities, but other impacts on the species. Species must be reviewed every 5 years, and so it's constantly rolling. They're constantly looking at species, but a formal report on every single threatened and endangered species in California must be updated, must be reported once every 5 years. Wild animals, California Fish and Game prohibits importation, possession, or live release of any wild animal on a state list of species. And I used to work for some wildlife rehab folks and did a lot of rescues of animals, and occasionally had some endangered species and had to be very careful about it. And luckily I knew who to call and I knew what to do, even though, technically I wasn't allowed to even touch one of the endangered species. You got to be careful. You got to know what you're doing, and you can't trap and sell. You can't do anything. Even any wild animal. This is not just protected. This is not just threatened animals. If you have an animal that is not considered a pest or nuisance animal, you can't hold it. You can't sell it. You can't keep it as a pet. There are lots of restrictions on keeping wild animals, whether they're threatened or not. Natural communities conservation planning at the California level, this is very much the same thing. This is broad-based planning to provide protection and conservation of threatened and endangered species. It allows appropriate development and growth for the species, as well as for human activity adjacent to these habitats. Its goal is to protect natural communities. I'm not going to get into the fee interest on lands, but that's just a legal way of having some sort of a, at least some financial interest or ownership interest in lands held within these conservation planning communities. Adaptive management, essentially using the results of new information so you're not stuck with your hands tied because your original plan said we're going to do this. Well, if you learn more, maybe you need to do that. Maybe you got to change it up because we learned more and what we were doing didn't work or isn't working as well. We need to change. We need to adapt. We need to learn. And that is specifically written into the California law that our community conservation can be adaptive and grow as our knowledge grows, as we monitor, gather science and data from these communities. The community's conservation planning can include listed species and non-listed species. Again, this is a community, and communities need to be functioning. There's a huge web of interactions of how nutrients flow through these environmental communities, and how the food chain works, and how energy flows not only through food but through nesting sites and everything else. And so you need to look at it as a complex watch, not just the hour hand on the face of the watch. And so looking at these communities with key indicators, key species as part of the plan makes a lot of sense. Now, it's too complex to have everything, thousands of species in the community that we're simultaneously monitoring and considering. You can't do that, but you can have several key species that are not listed among your listed ones that give a better indication of community health and progress in your environmental goals. Government volunteers landowners to be regulated. I love that line. I wish I could take credit for it, but the government volunteers you to be regulated. Before the community's conservation plan is approved, a plan participant means the agency that signed an agreement to develop the community's conservation plan. After the plan is approved, a plan participant means the permittees, that is, the landowners affected by the NCCP, who will need permits, and any local agency that is a signatory to the implementing agreement. The real takeaway message from this slide is, as a landowner, you don't get the say. If you are part of this plan, you can speak up during critical habitat development discussions, but once you end up being part of the plan, you're volunteered as part of the plan. You don't have a choice. You are being volunteered by the government, and it's like, guess what? You're part of this. Don't want to be part of it? Too bad. Sell your land. All right. Now we're going to move to another very closely related act, the Native Plant Protection Act, another California law. And this law recognizes the fact that plants are different. Plants are not the same as managing animals, vertebrates or invertebrates. Plants require some extra language, some distinct language to effectively function in a way that we can protect them. And so just like the ESA or the California ESA, we're trying to preserve, protect, and enhance endangered or rare native plants. Permits are not required for nurseries. It's one thing to trap and keep an animal captive. It's another to be growing plants in a nursery and growing seed, saving seed. Now, you can't go dig them up in the wild and bring them into your nursery and steal them for the wild so you can sell them. You can't do that. But you can, with proper care, take seeds or cuttings from the wild and then start propagating them in your nursery. And that can be a good thing, because then you can spread those plants out, sell them to people who want to grow native plants, habitat restoration. Maybe the government will buy it for restoring plants to areas devastated by fire, whatever. You can grow them, and that's very different than handling animals. No public agency authorized or required to mandate, prescribe, or otherwise regulate agricultural operations or management practices, including the clearing of land for agricultural practices or fire control measures. So here's another protection. where the intent of this law is to protect plants, but not be an additional hurdle for either agricultural operations or fire protection operations. Controlled burns, for example. If I'm doing controlled burns to protect the forest from all going up in these massive fires like we're having these days, that's actually a good thing. And we've got to be really careful about it. We have stopped doing that. I spent several years doing controlled burns during the winter when I worked for the Forest Service. And we didn't do enough of it then. There wasn't enough money to do as much as I think we should have. And then we cut way back since I was a young adult doing that. And fire's a natural thing. Lightning starts fires all the time. And so we need to burn out the undergrowth in certain areas. That helps a healthy environment. If you let the undergrowth get too thick, too big, then the fire kills everything. Even the big established trees die. And that's not what happens in a natural fire environment. But our laws for the endangered species protection, habitat protection, air quality standards have stood in the way in California, as well as financial concerns. It's not just about environmental stuff. It's also people not being willing to spend the money to do what we need to do some more controlled burns. And I would imagine that the current situation is going to change that. Probably going to be doing more winter controlled burns so we can have a less disastrous summer, fall, year after year. Try and break those fires up into smaller pieces. Anyway, the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. You might hear that sometimes. CEQA, what the heck CEQA? Well, it's the California Environmental Quality Act, started in 1970. No surprise, you know, I've talked many times about when environmental laws have really started to take hold, and that was 68 to 75 was the vast majority of them, at least got started in that range. Everything else was kind of fixing from there. So what does CEQA do? To take all action necessary to protect, rehabilitate, and enhance the environmental quality of the state of California. Public projects are the same as private projects. Doesn't matter. Any project must fall within the scope of CEQA. It protects fish, it protects wildlife, and one of the unique habitats in California, our oak woodlands. Oak trees in our oak woodland areas, like we have so much of in California, they are a unique habitat of our state that is protected as something that's very important, very unique. Government should not approve projects as proposed if there are feasible alternatives, or feasible mitigation measures, and you must write an environmental impact report. So the idea is, if I'm going to be putting up a set of stairs in my backyard to go up to the swing, do I need an environmental impact report? No. Monterey County, I probably need a permit, but I don't need an environmental impact report. But if I'm going to bring 500 acres of farmland, potential farmland that's never been farmed before, it's just been, you know, our old hunting land in our family for generations. Nobody's been doing anything but hunting hogs and deer on it for generations. Now we want to start farming it. Am I going to have to do an environmental impact report? Oh yeah. Or I want to put in a 200 home subdivision. Am I going to have to do an EIR, environmental impact report? Oh yeah. So there's these points, and I'm not going to get into it at all right now, but there's some point that you trigger CEQA. And as soon as you trigger CEQA, you're in a whole different development ballgame. I need a new water heater. I deal with the county. All I have to do is get a permit, pay my fee, do whatever I need to do. I do something big enough to trigger CEQA, and I'm in a whole new realm of political and financial responsibility. Environmental impact reports are not cheap. I've only been involved in the writing of one of them, and I think just our little piece of the report was like $40,000 to write. And I have no idea how much the whole report cost, but I'm sure it was way north of $100,000 to write that report. And that's just one piece of being able to do the project. But if you're looking to build 200 homes in a given area, a couple $100,000 to get your foot in the door is not a big deal. Now there's NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA, it was passed by Congress in 1969. And so NEPA at the national level came in 1969, and then immediately California jumped in with CEQA. And it was pretty clear at the time. Now I'm too young to remember exactly what was going on then, but certainly I bumped up into this area enough times to know California was not sufficiently satisfied with NEPA. It didn't have enough teeth in it. It wasn't substantive enough. And so California created CEQA only 9 months after the feds came out with NEPA. NEPA is more procedural and CEQA more substantive. So NEPA, you got to follow the rules. You got to just go through the motions, you got to follow the steps. If you are in a project and it triggers NEPA, you follow the rules at the federal level and you do your homework and you keep moving. CEQA, you really got to do stuff. It's not just checking boxes and writing reports. It's more substantive, meaning there's more real environmental work that you have to do. It also is more strict in what is allowed and what's not allowed. And, if you're going to trigger NEPA here, it's going to take a project this big with NEPA. CEQA triggers down here. It's going to be more than steps in my backyard, but a good size expansion or development of homes or something, it doesn't take as much at all in California to trigger that environmental impact report requirement and other aspects of CEQA. They often go hand in hand, NEPA, CEQA, because if you trigger one, there's a good chance your project is not in that area between. There's a good chance you trigger one, you trigger them both, and you've got to deal with it at the state and federal level for whatever project you're doing. So an environmental impact report, or EIR, know that acronym. That's one you should know in laws and regs. Required for projects likely to have significant impacts. Impacts on what? Impacts on the environment. And the environment doesn't have to mean the natural environment. That, a lot of people think, oh, significant impacts on wildlife and nature and fisheries and the rivers and things like that. It also could be traffic patterns. It also could be demand for police and fire in a given area. All kinds of things that could be part of the community and the city impact on people. Government can make a negative declaration, which is a written statement, reasons a proposed project will not have a significant effect on the environment. So let's say you are proposing a project and technically it triggers CEQA. So if the government comes in, if you are able to make a case to your county and state government officials and say, our project is not going to have a significant impact And we don't think we should be held responsible and trigger CEQA. The government officials in charge can write this negative declaration, and it's negative in a good way for the developer. It's negative in the way that you're saying, no, this does not have an impact on the environment or on our community in such a way that we think an environmental impact report is required. And so it's kind of like going to the doctor and you go in for that cancer screening or something and you get a negative declaration. Your test results were negative. That's a good thing. That means you don't have cancer, right? Negative meaning you don't have to. You don't have it in the doctor's office, or you don't have to in the case of an environmental impact report. Now, I haven't seen too many of those personally, but I have heard of them occasionally happening where for one reason or another, it's deemed unnecessary. What is a project? A project is an activity which may cause either a direct physical change in the environment, building homes, putting in a dam, putting transmission lines underground, all kinds of things, or a reasonably foreseeable indirect physical change in the environment, whatever that might be. So if you're going to change the environment in some way, if you're going to be out there doing things, you need to do an EIR. That's it for this one.